This game was one of the bloodiest and goriest ever released for the Super Nintendo. It featured brutal armed combat, epic decapitations, and wild fatalities. And no, we're not talking about Mortal Kombat. This is a 2D fighting game that had the potential to be one of the most advanced at the time, and was the first ever fighting game designed to be played online. It's a game you may not have heard of, but has influenced some of the biggest franchises in the world. This is Weaponlord. Weaponlord was developed by Visual Concepts and published by Namco for the SNES and Sega Genesis. The game was designed by James Goddard, Dave Winstead, and Stephen Chiang. Goddard was one of the top American fighting game developers at the time, known for his work on Street Fighter II as the creator of the character DJ. In 1993, at the invitation of fellow game designer Ken Lobb, Goddard broke away from Capcom to work on a new project at Namco, codenamed Melee. No, not that Melee. Once Goddard signed on, Lobb left to work on what would become Killer Instinct, leaving Goddard in charge of this new undeveloped project. Now at the helm of his own game, Goddard invited David Winstead, whom he worked with at Capcom R&D, to help him figure out what this new game was going to be. Both shared a devout love of fighting games and wanted to make something markedly different than the Street Fighters and Mortal Kombats on the market already. The result was Weaponlord, a 2D 16-bit fighting game that was truly ahead of its time. The first thing you'll notice about the game is its art style. Goddard and Winstead wanted to be totally different from Street Fighter, King of Fighters, and other Japanese fighting games. They wanted something that reflected the artwork of Simon Bisley and Frank Frazetta that was over the top, gory, and dripping with machismo. They settled on a barbarian theme, redolent of Conan and Highlander. The characters wear little, if any, clothing, bear rippling muscles, and wield swords, axes, and shields. The stages are based on gladiator arenas and feature mountains of skulls. Characters can perform fatalities, disemboweling their opponents, decapitating their body as it crumples to the floor, and exploding their head with a swing of the sword. This mechanic, while brutally awesome, is also vital to the game's story mode, because if you don't finish your opponent with a fatality, they come back to challenge you later in the game. Due to memory limitations, the game only had 7 characters, but those characters have much bigger move lists than what was normal at the time, and were each totally unique. From the outset, Goddard wanted to make one thing clear. This was not a pick-up-and-play fighting game. Weaponlord was meant to appeal to hardcore, competitive fans, and Goddard intentionally set out to create a title that would not reward button mashing, inviting players to actually learn the game's mechanics, combos, and intricacies. Let's start with the first big difference between Weaponlord and literally every other fighting game: the controls. For the sake of being different than Street Fighter, motion inputs aren't quarter circle then press a button, it's hold a button, then input the quarter circle. It's a little bit weird and annoying, but once you get the hang of it, it's not that bad. Then comes the actual game design. Weaponlord is a weapon-based fighting game, which means everyone has these big, disjointed hitboxes that don't have hurt boxes. According to Winstead, quote, "We were really pushing to keep players at close range, so we designed the game to make everyone use their weapons as much as possible. With this in mind, the game features a ton of distinct weapon interactions. First off, weapons clash with each other. If 2 characters throw out an attack that come out on overlapping frames, the weapons will hit each other and reset neutral. There's some momentum shift if one character throws out a light and the other throws out a heavy, but not much. The most important is the one that really defines Weaponlord's combat, is thrust blocking, better known today as parrying. While the technique was popularized by games like Soul Calibur and Third Strike, Weaponlord was one of the first games to have thrust blocking as a core gameplay-defining mechanic. Basically, holding back to block will always leave you at a disadvantage, but if you thrust block, your weapon will clash with your opponents, causing them to recoil and leaving them vulnerable. In short, the game aims to reward precise, intentional defensive play rather than just hiding in the corner and waiting out a block string.
I like the look of this game, but not the gameplay. It was basic bash the buttons.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Then, there are variations on thrust blocks. There are power deflects, which don't do much damage if they hit the opponent, but deal extra recoil when clashing with a weapon. There's the mid deflect, which is a thrust block with an immediate follow-up right after. The benefit is that you don't have to hit confirm on reaction, but it's way more committing because if you miss the first thrust block, you're gonna end up in a lot of lag. Finally, there are Samsho-inspired catchers, which, when followed up with a weapon breaker, destroys your opponent's weapon, reducing their range and damage, and it's usually as good as a win. And those are just weapon interactions. There's a guard crush called an opener, which kicks the door down on anyone who thinks they can hold back for free. There are takedowns, which knock your opponent on their back, leaving them vulnerable to OTGs. If you hit your opponent in the gut, they'll double over and be locked in stun for longer, and if you hit them in the knees, they'll be staggered, giving you a free follow-up. One really cool feature is that if your opponent is mid-attack and you barely miss with the swing of your sword, the weapon will cut off a piece of their hair or helmet. With so many systems and so many different moves that counter each other in this complex web of RPS interactions, it's important to note that Goddard and Winstead were completely aware of things like frame advantage. Every attack was programmed with plus-minus in mind, and for a game that came out in 1995, it's incredibly well balanced. All of these different systems come together in what really feels like a modern fighting game. While it was maybe a bit over-designed and alienating for new players to try and learn the weird controls, at its core, it's a fundamentally good game. And that's not all. Here's the thing that made Weaponlord truly special. It was designed specifically to be played online. Back in 1995, dial-up connections were barely even a thing. And since the game wasn't designed for PCs, how the heck were people connecting to each other? Well, it's a little thing called X-Band. X-Band released in 1994. Just to give you a little bit of context, in 1996, the first version of Google was released. A year prior, Windows 95 and JavaScript came out. X-Band predates so many technological advancements and was the first online console experience. Here's how X-Band works. You buy X-Band for $20 and you get a modem that fits into the cartridge slot of your SNES or Genesis. Once you plug it into your router, you can insert your game into the X-Band cartridge, and when you boot up your console, you'll be taken to the X-Band homepage. From here, you can pick your game, connect to other players, and even send mail and call other X-Band users. You could play with friends, or use a matchmaking system that would attempt to match you with other players of a similar ELO. Seriously, the features in this thing are mind-boggling. Unfortunately, most games on X-Band were not designed with the service in mind. So, X-Band had to employ game crackers who would inject code into games like Madden 94 and Mario Kart to allow them to be played online, peer-to-peer. For some games, it worked just fine. In Mario Kart, you're racing along and it doesn't really matter what other people are doing. But more timing-precise games like Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat 3 didn't work that well.
Come on, win, friendship.
Because these games were designed to be played in person, the lag of trying to play online in the mid-90s meant that there wasn't time to react to certain things, like cross-ups. While it's pretty easy to see that someone's jumping, throwing out a kick, and switching the direction you're blocking, when there's input lag, it's almost impossible. Thankfully, the team was intimately familiar with X-Band. They foresaw online play as the future and believed that if their game was going to be played on X-Band, it would need to be done the right way. With 5 months left in the game's development, Goddard and Winstead went in and made adjustments so the game would feel good online. This included things like calibrating parry animations to be reactable based on a peer-to-peer connection from New York to San Francisco, delaying the timing of cross-up so that the timing would be more lenient for the person blocking, and a bunch of other timing and input-related fixes. Goddard said, quote, "Knowing we were going to have a quarter-second lag from New York to California, we realized we couldn't have any startup frames on our thrust blocks. We also added cross-up protection by designing a rising thrust block that would counter those attacks easily. With this attention to detail, Weaponlord was officially the first fighting game to ever be developed with online play in mind. In fact, it's the only game to have the X-Band logo on its box. And while Goddard admits that the code they used wasn't the most efficient, breaking trail in such uncharted territory is never going to be perfect. And for 1995, their work on Weaponlord was downright futuristic. Unfortunately, while X-Band was undoubtedly ahead of its time, the SNES and Genesis were on the way out. And so was X-Band. The modem's low cost and affordable subscription meant that the company was never turning a profit. This, coupled with the release of Sony's PlayStation in 1994, meant that Weaponlord never really had a chance to shine. Games with 3D models and better hardware were just way more appealing to players, while 16-bit 2D fighters were on the way out. Perhaps if Weaponlord released a few years earlier, it would be held in the same regard as its contemporaries. The game had tons of fans who hailed it as the most complex, true competitive fighting game they'd ever played, and many lament that it never got a chance to shine. As for Goddard, Winstead, and Chiang, after finishing Weaponlord, all three remained in the gaming industry. James Goddard went on to work on Killer Instinct with Ken Lobb, and then worked extensively on Mortal Kombat. David Winstead works at Stoic Studios and helped publish Towerborn with the help of Goddard. Stephen Chiang went on to become the GM of Warner Bros. Games and Executive Vice President of the most recent Mortal Kombat game. The three are still very tightly connected, and their roots as true fighting game fans in the 90s and their work on Weaponlord has truly shaped fighting games into what they are today. And many are still holding out for Weaponlord to be remastered, re-released, and remade today. Plus, you can play the game online, so go give it a try and tell us what you think. This video is made possible thanks to our wonderful patrons. Massive thank you to everyone on this list, and shout out to B, Pass, Shampoo, and Yashichi for being Platinum supporters, as well as an extra special shout out to Cloud, Steph, and Jack for being our Diamond supporters. We really appreciate it. If you want to talk to us, check out our Discord. If you want to support our channel and get info on unreleased videos, check out our Patreon. If you want to help us out in a different way, leaving a like, subscribing, and hitting the bell to stay up to date is also appreciated. My name is Jonah. Thanks for watching.